Like many people who drive up and down the A60 just outside Mansfield, I've driven past a part of an unusual piece of local history, totally unaware it was there, and the very sad and violent story behind it. On the 7th of July 1817, a 17-year-old girl from Papelwick called Elizabeth Sheppard left her home to walk to Mansfield in search of employment as a servant. She was dressed as all people do when applying for a job, in her best clothes with new shoes and a yellow umbrella. Bessie's luck was in. She secured a position, but unfortunately that was the last bit of luck she earned that day. Charles Rotherham from Sheffield, aged 33 and an ex-soldier turned scissor sharpener who had served in the Napoleonic Wars, had spent the afternoon drinking in the hut a little further down Mansfield Road, slowly getting more and more drunk. The same afternoon, Bessie's mother, concerned for her daughter's return, started off to look for her. She was some way towards Mansfield before she thought she saw Bessie in the distance. Mrs. Sheppard, thinking her daughter had seen her, turned tail and headed home. On her way home, she passed a stranger, who she later identified as Charles Rotherham. At around 6 p.m, Bessie was walking back from Mansfield, where she had an unfortunate meeting with Charles Rotherham at the southern side of Harlow Wood. It's not known what occurred between them, if indeed anything did, but for whatever reason, Rotherhams took a fence stake and smashed her repeatedly around the head until her skull caved in and her eyeballs slipped from its socket and rested on her cheek. Rotherham stole her new shoes, umbrella, and threw her body in a ditch. He then headed south towards Nottingham. The next day, Bessie's mangled body was discovered by some quarrymen, and the search for the murderer began. Rotherham had first tried to sell the shoes at the Ginger Ale House, now known as a 7 Mile Inn, halfway between Nottingham and Mansfield. He then made his way to Redhill, where he successfully sold the shoes at a public house called the 3 Crowns. And finally, he made his way through Nottingham and sold the umbrella at a public house in Bunny, now the Ranskill Arms. Rotherham was finally arrested en route to Loughborough, leaning over a bridge and looking at the river flow by. Constable Benjamin Barnes, the arresting officer, said Rotherham admitted the murder but offered no motive. In fact, he said, "I'm guilty of a crime and must suffer the course of the law." Rotherham was tried, found guilty, and at 7 a.m. on Monday the 28th of July, he was hung by the neck until dead on Gallows Hill, Nottingham, just inside what is now the entrance to Rock Cemetery, with a crowd estimated between 18 and 20,000. Once hung, like many of his kind, he was taken to the surgeons for dissection. Bessie's body was taken to St James's Church in Papelwick and buried in a quiet corner. Nowadays, at the scene of a roadside accident or death, we're used to seeing flowers left as a memorial to mark the spot. 200 years ago, that sort of thing was unheard of, but for some unprecedented reason, the townsmen of Mansfield got together and in February 1819 put a memorial in the spot where poor Bessie was murdered. Since the murder, there have been a number of spooky happenings around the monument. In 1988, the police were called to the grave because the vandals had removed the gravestone. To publicise the incident, officers, together with the Evening Post photographer, visited the monument itself. Whilst they were there being photographed touching the monument, one of the officers was inspired to go back to the grave and conduct a further search. The gravestone was found under some hedging and was replaced on the grave. There are numerous stories of the ghost of Bessie Sheppard in the vicinity of the monument. Motorists have stopped to give a lift to a girl with no shoes, who then disappeared. She has allegedly been seen many times by staff on the old wards of Harlow Hospital. There was even a story left on a bulletin board, which went something along the lines of this. One evening in 1985, I was in my dorm room and heard her tapping at my window. When I went to the window, there was a young lady standing there asking for help finding her shoes. I offered to help, of course, and went outside to help her. We walked a short distance to the road, and I started looking in the underbush for her shoes. After about 10 minutes, I turned to the lady and asked how she'd lost them. She told me she must have taken them off while walking home because they were rubbing her heels. I turned back to looking, and after a few seconds I turned to where she had been, but she was no longer there. The next morning I told my story to an orderly who told me about the murder of Bessie Sheppard. Legend has it that if a stone is disturbed, her ghost will appear, and in the late 1930s the stone was moved a few yards when the road was widened, and for several days after, a ghostly apparition was seen in the area. In the early 1950s the memorial again was disturbed when it was struck by a car, and shortly afterwards, a young couple on their way to Mansfield reported seeing a white figure hovering over the stone. For me, the story leaves too many unanswered questions. How was Rotherham caught so quickly? Was he suffering from PTSD? And just what is an interesting girl, as Bessie was described in the newspapers of the time? Why, above all other things that must happen, was a monument erected for this one girl, and why mention a killer's name on the monument? Maybe, or perhaps, what we have here is an example of a miscarriage of justice and an early form of fake news diverting the populace from what really happened. Or maybe not. In the end, we'll never know. If you've enjoyed this story, please have a look at the book The Murder of Bessie Sheppard by Dave Marshall, which will give you far more information than I've been able to get through in this one short video, and perhaps a different view on what may really have happened.